Democrats like to remember President Bill Clinton as the man who balanced the budget and led America through an economic boom. But the truth is, he destroyed the middle class, catered to Wall Street, and pushed blue-collar working Americans straight into the arms of Donald J. Trump.
Political bear nation ready to dive, where opinions spark and the debates thrive. Hold on tight.
Hey guys, I'm Brown Chubby Bear, and this is Political Bear Nation. As Democrats, we tend to put Bill Clinton on a pedestal, largely because of the economic growth the United States experienced during his presidency. America had the longest peacetime growth in U.S. history between 1993 and 2001, and unemployment fell to just 4%, a level that had been considered impossible just years earlier. But was it Clinton and his policies that led to such a prosperous economy? In the 1990s, we experienced a technology revolution. The internet, as we know it today, was just starting to take off. Portable computers, now known as laptops, and even smartphones were just making their way to consumers. The internet revolution was the greatest technological leap in American history, and it just so happened to take place during the Bill Clinton presidency. Online shopping with sites like Amazon and eBay were quickly becoming popular. Microsoft hit nearly $5 billion of revenue in 1994, and Sun Microsystems, which was the backend that actually allowed all of this technology to work, reached $7 billion in 1995. It also allowed small businesses and individuals to compete on a national scale, even if they were in small-town Wallace, Idaho, or Whitefish, Montana. But Clinton didn't have anything to do with the internet. In fact, it was his vice president and former Senator Al Gore that led the way for the commercial internet as we know it today. Those that are old enough probably remember the jokes about Al Gore saying that he invented the internet.
During my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet.
But even the engineers that developed the protocols that would become the internet, like Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, said Al Gore was the first political leader to recognize the importance of the internet and to promote and support its development. See, in the 1980s, the United States government and private research universities used networks like ARPANET and NSFNet to conduct scientific and military research. But it was not accessible to the public. It was Al Gore who saw the potential of what he called the information superhighway and asked Congress to fund the development of a system that could be accessed by all Americans. And this was all the way back in 1986, when Al Gore was just a senator from Tennessee. He was laughed at for years, but in 1991, he secured $1.7 billion in funding and convinced Republican President George H.W. Bush to back the legislation by changing his strategy and selling the idea as an economic national security issue. The commercialization of the internet allowed Bill Clinton to take credit for a booming American economy. And we also give him credit for balancing the budget. But again, guess who led the initiative to systematically eliminate waste from the federal government? It was Al Gore. Gore led the National Performance Review, which was created to identify and cut billions in unnecessary spending, streamline federal operations, and improve efficiency across multiple federal agencies. And Gore's role wasn't just symbolic, he was hands-on, and he didn't use outside consultants the way Republicans wanted him to do. He used career civil servants and held town halls with tens of thousands of federal employees before actually making the changes. It was methodical and effective, much different from the failure of Elon Musk's Doge. Gore saved the taxpayers $137 billion over 5 years. That's about $300 billion in today's money. Whereas Trump and Elon Musk left Doge with just $3 billion in verifiable savings. However, Elon's plan was so terrible that experts have determined that with all the disruption of firing and hiring back federal employees and the ongoing litigation, it will actually end up costing taxpayers $135 billion. Now, to give Clinton some credit, he did raise taxes on wealthy individuals, and he also raised the gas tax. But he also benefited from the end of the Cold War. Again, something he had nothing to do with. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't much of a reason to pour so much money into defense. Defense spending went from 4.3% of GDP in 1993 to just 2.9% by the year 2000. The rise of the internet, the effectiveness of the National Performance Review, and the fall of the Soviet Union allowed Clinton to pay down the debt by over $450 billion by the year 2000. While Clinton deserved some credit for making the right choices and not carrying on the excessive military budgets of his Republican predecessors, it was Al Gore that did the hard work of getting funding for the internet to even exist and work with every federal agency to reduce spending. But Clinton was the president, so he got the credit. Now let's shift over to NAFTA, and this is kind of a weird one because Clinton executed the agreement, but it was actually negotiated by the Reagan and Bush administrations. On December 17, 1992, President H.W. Bush, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed the Trilateral Agreement a month before Clinton took office. But it was Clinton who turned NAFTA into law nearly a year later on December 8, 1993. So we cannot put the faulty negotiations on Clinton's shoulders alone. However, Clinton did choose to implement NAFTA. He chose to defend it publicly. He chose to take credit for it. And he chose to defend big business when it was clear that NAFTA was actually a failure. The cracks in the agreement were showing just a year after its execution. Luis Colosio was running for the president of Mexico, but he was assassinated. By the way, the gun that killed him was purchased in San Francisco. Anyway, after the assassination, there were very few PRI members allowed to run for public office based on their strict party bylaws. So Ernest Zedillo, who was running Colosio's campaign, was chosen by his party to run in his place. Just 20 days after Zedillo was elected president of Mexico, he chose to devalue the peso. And the peso collapsed by about 50%. And suddenly, Mexico couldn't pay back their short-term debt. Now, this didn't just hurt Mexico. It threatened the American economy because banks like Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and Chase started financing Mexican industries and buying up Mexican government debt. About $65 billion of American capital flowed into Mexico from 1990 to 1994 because of NAFTA. And to make matters worse, about $15 billion of those dollars were from mutual funds that regular blue-collar Americans had in their 401ks, and another $10 to $15 billion were from American pension funds. There was little to no regulation to prevent this, so the banks made risky bets with our money, and now the banks needed help. Clinton asked Congress for a $50 billion bailout package to help the Mexican government, but Congress said no. So instead, he worked with Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin and used the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which was designed to stabilize American currency, not to bail out sovereign nations. But he bypassed Congress entirely and sent a $20 billion loan to Mexico. Clinton worked with the International Monetary Fund, and together they gave Mexico the $50 billion bailout package that they needed to pay back their short-term loans, which about a quarter ended up back in American banks. This should have been an important lesson for Clinton. While I don't actually blame Bill Clinton for implementing NAFTA, because 85% of American economists on both sides of the political spectrum thought NAFTA would help the American economy, I do blame him for not learning from this near disaster, as you'll see later in this video. And if you want to see more political breakdowns like this, please hit that subscribe button and share this with a friend. Now, Clinton can't be held fully responsible for NAFTA, but he is directly to blame for granting China's permanent normal trade relations status and backing China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Clinton actually said something that aged like milk. For the first time, our companies will be able to sell and distribute products in China made by workers here in America without being forced to relocate manufacturing to China. We'll be able to export products without exporting jobs.
Oh, it curdled, oh, it cracked. Yesterday's treasure ain't coming back. This age like milk, not smooth, not silk. What a spill, what a till. This age like milk.
That was literally one of the worst predictions that was ever made. In 1999, the United States imported $81 billion in goods from China while exporting only $13 billion to China. That's a $68 billion trade deficit, and that was before Clinton gave China permanent normal trade relations. By 2000, the U.S. was importing over $100 billion of goods from China while only exporting about $28 billion, a deficit of $83 billion. Today, that trade deficit is nearly $300 billion. Now, of course, trade deficits are not inherently bad, something that Donald Trump still doesn't understand. But what was bad was the job losses. Between 1999 and 2011, about 985,000 American manufacturing jobs were directly lost to China's ability to export virtually anywhere in the world. This was only made possible by Clinton's sponsorship of China into the World Trade Organization. And if we include indirect manufacturing jobs, like the production of steel and chemicals, that total comes to 2.4 million job losses. And by 2017, that number grew to 5.5 million job losses. And 3/4 of these jobs were good-paying manufacturing jobs. 75% of these jobs did not require a college education. 60% of these jobs had employer-provided pensions, and 85% of these jobs had good employer-provided health insurance. These job losses hit hard in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. All of these states, except for North Carolina, voted for Bill Clinton. But all of these states ended up voting for Donald Trump in 2024 because they felt betrayed. And why shouldn't they have felt betrayed? They lost good-paying jobs, and the messaging from Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party was, this is going to be good for America in the long run. Now, President Obama did try to build a green manufacturing sector, but he was only able to create roughly 185,000 jobs nationwide, a far cry from the 5.5 million jobs that were lost. But much of his focus had to stay on rebuilding the economy after the 2008 crash, a crisis triggered by the deregulatory policies that Clinton implemented throughout his presidency. To understand financial deregulation under Clinton, we first need to understand what the Glass-Steagall Act was. It was passed in 1933 after the Great Depression. It separated commercial banking, where ordinary people like you and me deposited money and got small loans for homes and cars, which was very different from investment banking. That's where banks essentially gambled with securities and other exotic financial products to make quick money. The reasoning was straightforward. Don't allow banks to gamble with money from regular depositors. Separate regular banking from speculative investing. In order to rebuild the trust that was lost and prevent the bank runs that helped crash the American economy in 1929, FDR created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which protects the money that you give your bank. Banks would hold on to your money and make sound basic loans for personal homes and cars and business loans to people they felt that could pay them back. But banks said they felt handcuffed. They wanted to gamble with your money because they could make huge short-term gains, even though it was much riskier to do so. Because of this, the Glass-Steagall Act had been under pressure since the 1970s. The SEC and the Federal Reserve started granting exemptions to banks to help the economy grow. Now, Bill Clinton saw firsthand what happened when the United States failed to regulate what corporations did with your money. If you remember, he spent $20 billion bypassing Congress so Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and Chase wouldn't collapse. But in April 1998, Citicorp and the Travelers Companies announced a $74.5 billion merger, which is about $148 billion in today's money, and that illegally combined regular commercial banking with insurance underwriting, the very thing Glass-Steagall was meant to prevent, and Clinton let it happen. It created the second largest securities firm in the nation, behind Merrill Lynch. During a public meeting regarding the merger of Citicorp and Travelers Group, Karen Thomas, who was representing the Independent Bankers Association of America, said, "It is an illegal merger, announced with the express intent of pressuring Congress into making it legal. First, it violates the Bank Holding Company Act by seeking to combine insurance underwriting and banking. Second, it violates the Glass-Steagall Act by invading the barriers between investment and commercial banking established by Congress 65 years ago." But did Clinton listen to her? No. On November 12, 1999, Clinton signed the Gramm-Leach-Bailey Act, officially repealing the key provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act. And Robert Rubin, who was the Secretary of Treasury under Bill Clinton, eventually left his position within the government and became the chairman of the executive committee of the board that ran Citigroup. But this wasn't the only thing that Clinton allowed to happen under his watch that directly led to the financial collapse in 2008. Some of you may be familiar with the term financial derivatives, which were blamed for causing the housing crisis. These are technically called over-the-counter or OTC derivatives. Now, they're called that because they are private deals between two parties without a centralized marketplace. You've probably heard the term credit default swaps as well. That is actually one type of OTC derivative. A credit default swap is basically an insurance policy on a loan, but with the twist, you don't have to actually own the loan to buy the insurance policy for it. Imagine you lent Charlie money to start a lemonade stand, but you aren't really sure that he'll ever be able to pay you back. So you pay someone else, let's call him Zach, a small fee. And he promises that as long as you keep paying him these fees, he will cover your loss if Charlie's lemonade stand ever fails. Now, imagine someone else, let's call her Mary, who has no financial ties to you, Charlie, or Zach, but thinks she knows Charlie's business is going to fail. So she buys insurance from Zach too, betting on Charlie's failure. Mary didn't lend any money to Charlie directly, but she's betting on Charlie's failure by buying an insurance policy from Zach. Now imagine if 100 people all bet that Charlie would fail and bought insurance policies from Zach. If Charlie actually succeeds, Zach collects all the fees and makes a profit. But if Charlie defaults, Zach must pay you, Mary, and everyone else who bet against Charlie. In the real finance world, banks and hedge funds were doing this with thousands of mortgages bundled together, not just one lemonade stand. They were betting millions, and sometimes even billions, on whether these loans would fail, which is exactly what made the system so fragile in 2008. Because the banks that were making these insurance policies weren't actually required to have the cash to pay out these insurance policies if everyone came to collect at once. In August 1996, Brooksley Born, chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, or the CFTC, saw that over-the-counter derivatives market was up to $25 trillion in value and growing at a rate of 20% every year. That means banks, hedge funds, and individual private investors were making a ton of bets on whether someone would default on their loan. This was straight-up gambling. And there was zero transparency, no record keeping, no regulatory oversight. Banks were leveraged by 30 or even 40 times. Brooksley Born thought it was a ticking time bomb, and she was right. And as head of the CFTC, she wanted to regulate these derivatives. But Clinton ignored her. In fact, Clinton's entire administration made her look like a crazy person that was trying to stifle the American economy. In March 1997, Larry Summers, who was at that time the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, told her, "I have 13 bankers in my office, and they say if you go forward with this, you will cause the worst financial crisis since World War II." Alan Greenspan, who was chair of the Federal Reserve Board, also opposed derivative regulation.
Regulation of derivatives transactions that are privately negotiated by professionals is unnecessary.
And before Robert Rubin left the government to work at Citigroup, he too opposed derivative regulation. Then in June 1998, Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, and SEC Chair Arthur Levitt jointly asked Congress to create new legislation to prevent Born from regulating derivatives during her term. They essentially said she wasn't qualified enough to recommend regulations, which was quite misogynistic, honestly, but it was an accepted argument at that time. Then, in September 1998, Long-Term Capital Management, or LTCM, nearly collapsed. LTCM was a hedge fund that had $4.3 billion in equity capital, but had leveraged that into $1.25 trillion in derivatives. LTCM had bet heavily on Russian government bonds, and Russia devalued its currency. Sound familiar? LTCM lost 52% of its value in just 1 month. The Federal Reserve had to coordinate an emergency bailout, and in September 1998, a group of 14 banks and brokerage firms invested $3.625 billion to prevent LTCM from defaulting. LTCM's near collapse vindicated Born's warning to Clinton, but while Born was proven right, Clinton did nothing to prevent this from happening again. In fact, he doubled down on his financial deregulatory philosophy. Congress passed legislation that explicitly prohibited the CFTC from any oversight of financial derivatives during Born's term. And shortly after that, Born stepped down. And then, just to ensure derivatives would never be regulated, on December 21, 2000, Clinton's last month in office, he signed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which explicitly exempted OTC derivatives from regulation by both the CFTC and the SEC. Not only did Clinton fail to listen to multiple women sounding the alarm, he experienced 2 near crashes of the American economy during his presidency and still chose to move ahead and deregulate the banking industry even more. And credit default swaps, this unregulated insurance policy that anyone could make bets on, was directly responsible for the 2008 financial collapse. There is no other word I can use to describe him but reckless.
I feel your pain.
And then came the crime bill, a $30 billion package called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, signed into law in September of 1994. One of the worst things it added was the federal 3 strikes provision. This mandated life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for anyone convicted of a serious felony after 2 prior felonies. And while the federal law restricted the types of crimes this was used for, it encouraged state lawmakers to compete with each other on who was tougher on crime.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, it doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. They must be taken off the street.
This led to states creating similar legislation, but without the same restrictions as the original federal law. California was one of those states. Curtis Wilkerson was raised by a single mother, a mother who was also a drug addict, and died when he was just 16 years old. That led him to make some pretty bad decisions, and he became the lookout for a string of burglaries. Now, he was caught, and he served 6 years in prison for his crimes. When he got out, he became a forklift operator. Things were going well, and he even found a loving girlfriend. But for whatever reason, while he was waiting for his girlfriend one day to get her hair done, he went over to a store and stole a $2.50 pair of socks. That triggered a mandatory sentencing for Wilkerson to 25 years to life in prison for stealing a pair of $2.50 socks. In California alone, 192 people were sent to prison because of simple marijuana possession. That's all it took to trigger the 3 strikes law. California, Florida, Louisiana had the harshest laws, but over half the country had similar 3 strikes laws. The 1994 crime bill also allocated $9 billion for prison construction and another $8 billion to hire 1,000 new police officers. But states only received this funding if they passed what's called truth in sentencing laws. That meant that inmates had to serve at least 85% of their sentences. Now, this was very favorable to private prisons. In fact, the Corrections Corporations of America, now renamed CoreCivic, which, by the way, has received well over $1 billion detaining undocumented immigrants since 2017, well, they had negotiated contracts in the 90s with state governments that included lockup quotas. That meant that states had to promise to keep the company's prisons anywhere from 80% to 100% full. The CCA funneled money through ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is an organization I actually talked about in my video last week about the Coors beer family. So go check that out. CCA and ALEC pushed this legislation through in 25 states, and the result? The average prison stay increased by 36%. The crime bill also created huge disparities between cocaine and crack. Cocaine was predominantly used in upper-class white neighborhoods, and crack was predominantly used in poor black neighborhoods. 500 grams of cocaine got you 5 years in prison, but 5 grams of crack got you that same 5 years. That meant people caught with a few grams of crack, who were often poor and black, would get the same sentence as a big-time cocaine trafficker who were often white and rich. Today, 61% of the incarcerated population is black or Latino, despite these groups making up only 30% of the US population. Even Bill Clinton admitted he screwed up. In 2015, he said, "I signed a bill that made the problem worse, and I want to admit it." And then we finally get to the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. Secretary of Human and Health Services Donna Shalala wanted him to veto it. Secretary of Labor Robert Reich wanted him to veto it. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Henry Sonaros wanted him to veto it. Even his Chief of Staff Leon Panetta wanted him to veto it. But on August 22, 1996, Clinton signed the bill anyway because he wanted to fulfill a campaign promise to reform welfare, and he thought this was the last chance he was going to get. The bill ended the federal guarantee of assistance for poor children, meaning Clinton signed the bill knowing it would make more children starve and cause more cases of child malnutrition. Instead of the federal government handling the program, it gave the job to the states. This gave states the power to restrict access and redirect funds to things like marriage counseling instead of food. Conservative red states felt it was immoral to financially assist single mothers that had children out of wedlock and reduced their benefits significantly. The bill normalized poverty, and during the 2008 financial crash, which was the direct result of Clinton's actions, welfare benefits would reach less than a quarter of the people that actually needed it. And this was during the second worst financial crisis in American history. All of this hurt America, and it hurt the Democratic Party. When Clinton ran for president, he received nearly 50% of the white, non-college educated vote. In 2024, Democrats only got 38% of the non-college educated white vote. Democrats stopped being the party for working people, the factory workers, the single moms, the folks just trying to get by, and instead cozied up with lobbyists, corporations, and the wealthy. We can't fix the future until we stop lying about the past. Bill Clinton's legacy isn't of a president that gave us a booming economy. It's a legacy of betrayal and failure. Idolizing Clinton and the centrist policies he promoted drove millions of working Americans into the arms of Donald Trump. This new generation of Democrats like AOC, Jasmine Crockett, Zoran Mamdani, James Tallarico, and Max LaFrost have to do what Clinton could not: rebuild trust and rebuild the American middle class. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel and check out some of my other videos.